Let's call the committee to, the subcommittee to order. CEO Nathan, welcome to the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to have you here. I also want to give a warm welcome to the members of the subcommittee. I apologize that I'm a little slow because I'm hobbling. I'm kind of limping around. I had a minor surgical issue on my foot. Not a big deal, but it just kind of slows you down a little bit. And so anyways, my apologies for that. Obviously not. Obviously not. Come on, let's have some order here, Lois Frankel. We have, as we know, we have a new member of the subcommittee that I know will come here later. I'll introduce him when he gets here. Today's hearing is on the fiscal year 2025 request for the United States International Development and Finance Corporation. Congress supported the launch of the DFC, the Official Development Finance Institution of the United States, in 2019 to really better mobilize private capital to support high-quality economic growth in low and middle-income countries, and frankly, with the basis of advancing United States foreign policy and national security priorities. I think a key reason Congress did that, passed the BUILD Act, also and created DFC, was to provide a competitive alternative to the very, I would say, aggressive predatory lending of the Communist Party of China around the world and other authoritarian governments who are constantly seeking to influence, to pressure, to blackmail poorer countries to succumb to their priorities. And as a result, as we know, that these other countries then are subjected to crushing debt owed to these malign states, particular, but not only China. DFC's initial 7-year authorization will expire in September of 2025, members, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of your reauthorization issues during the discussion today. DFC currently has a $60 billion lending cap, and its development portfolio has reached more than $40 billion across more than 100 countries. So, Mr. Nathan, your FY25 request is nearly $1.01 billion, a $25 million or 2.5% increase over the prior year. Of that amount, $763 million is requested for program expenses and $245 for administrative costs. $245 million for administrative costs. Most of the proposed increase would support administrative costs, including an expansion of DFC's overseas presence and the growth of its domestic workforce. And as you know, to date, the DFC has largely enjoyed strong bipartisan support, not only in this committee, but I would argue on Capitol Hill writ large. For example, I want to highlight DFC's partnership with its sister institutions in Taiwan, in Japan, Australia, Korea, precisely to advance shared development priorities in the Indo-Pacific, such as the Philippines, as well as here in the Western Hemisphere. DFC has also played an increasingly important role in supporting partners bearing the economic consequences of Russian aggression. I think these examples represent a clear tie to advancing U.S. national security interests and countering the influence of our adversaries who, as I said, are very aggressive and sometimes very effective. Some of us, however, are increasingly concerned that the White House's controversial policy blinders on issues like climate change are, frankly, impacting or hobbling DFC's ability to advance economic development and counter Russia and China in critical markets and regions around the world. I'm also very concerned that going too far down this Biden administration's quote-unquote woke agenda really jeopardizes this agency's widespread bipartisan support, something that is required. DFC is not alone in being pushed into misguided, counterproductive, and even harmful policies of the Biden administration. The Department of Treasury's restrictions on common sense investments, which are based on climate change virtue signaling, simply do not fit here. But even worse, these restrictions throw the door wide open for Communist China and are completely self-defeating from an economic and also a national security perspective. Another concern that I think is important to raise is DFC country eligibility standards, which I think likely result in missed opportunities to help nearshore critical supplies, supply chains, to counter China, and advance our economic and national security interests in this hemisphere, in Latin America. I hope during our hearing today that you can address these concerns and other issues that will play a key role in determining not only the funding for this fiscal year, but equally or more important, the future of the DFC in U.S. foreign policy. Again, you must keep bipartisan support. In closing, let me note that we appreciate your service, you and the folks that work with you in this important role, and that of the men and women who serve, again, in a very, very important roles in this agency. So with that, the ranking member is not here. So why don't we then, we'll recognize you for your written statement. Obviously, the entire statement will be placed on the record, as you know. You know the drill, right? And obviously, please feel free to summarize as you can, and we'll recognize you now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the opportunity to be here today to discuss our FY25 budget request for the United States International Development Finance Corporation. I want to thank Congress, and especially this committee, for its continued support of DFC. Since Congress established DFC, we've used the tools you've provided us to deliver on the BUILD Act's mandate to increase development and strategic impact of our investments all around the world. And DFC financing for the private sector enables reliable access to energy, supports high-quality infrastructure, including safe and secure digital connectivity. We're investing to strengthen health and food systems, while also supporting the small businesses that are vital to generating jobs and opportunity. Unlike the development approach of the PRC or other strategic competitors, DFC's efforts are directed toward supporting private entities, mobilizing private capital, and building resilient market economies. We're guided by the belief that developing a robust private sector is the best way to alleviate poverty over the long term and strengthen the economic and strategic positions of our partners all around the world. We need to show up and offer our partners a choice based on our values and on private enterprise, so they don't feel trapped into accepting the offerings of our strategic competitors or authoritarian governments. Too much debt and projects that aren't needed or of poor quality. In the nearly 5 years since Congress created it, DFC has made great progress in this regard. Last year, DFC committed a record $9.3 billion across 132 transactions, nearly double our FY20 total. By mobilizing additional private capital, our investments are making an impact, driving economic development where it's needed most, and advancing U.S. strategic objectives. We're investing to build roads, airports, ports, and other large-scale infrastructure projects in the developing world. For example, we've committed $553 million to support the construction of a new shipping container terminal in Sri Lanka, a critical transshipment point for the Indian subcontinent, and it promotes the free flow of goods across key trade routes across the Indo-Pacific. DFC is also promoting energy security by helping to diversify Eastern European energy supplies with large-scale projects in Poland, Moldova, Bulgaria, Georgia, and Greece. All these projects have helped the region shift away from its dependence on Russian gas. We're focused on securing the critical inputs and supply chains for the industries of the future, investing $150 million in graphite production in Mozambique, $50 million for rare earth oxides in South Africa, and almost $1 billion for multiple solar panel manufacturing facilities in India to ensure no one country has a chokehold on price and availability. Wherever we go, DFC works to ensure our projects meet the needs of local communities, from our $20 million commitment for cold storage in Africa to our $33 million loan to build grain silos in India. To maximize impact, DFC often partners with our peer development finance institutions. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned this. Recently, we affirmed our cooperation agreements with Japan and Korea and entered into a new compact with Taiwan's Development Finance Institution, amongst others. DFC has active projects in 112 countries, but our primary focus is the world's poorest countries. And in fiscal year 23, nearly 3/4 of our projects were in low and lower middle income countries. I'm proud of this track record, but I know that DFC can do much more. The global demand for high-quality, high-standard development finance far outstrips the supply. And we want to do more projects and have deeper collaboration, broader reach, more meaningful impact, and better metrics. For FY25, as you mentioned, the administration requests a budget of $1,008,000,000 for DFC to empower this agency to better meet its mission. This amounts to a less than 1% increase over FY23 enacted levels and a 2.6% increase over 2024. The FY25 request includes $763.4 million in program funds that would allow us to grow our overall portfolio and continue supporting strategic and developmental projects around the world. The request would extend our fee authority, giving us the ability to use fees collected from clients to pay for project-specific transaction costs. Not only will this be beneficial to taxpayers by allowing us to shift upfront costs to clients, it will also create an incentive for their projects to reach completion on schedule. The budget request also includes administrative expenses of $245 million, as you mentioned. This funding underpins all the work DFC does around the world, and it's our hope that the small increase in our operating budget will help us become a more capable and efficient organization. DFC has taken many steps to improve its structure along a sector-based approach, and we're seeking additional resources from Congress to build upon this progress. The FY25 budget requests additional resources to attract and retain talented and highly in-demand workforce that DFC needs. Growing our deal origination, processing, and monitoring teams will enable greater impact. Finally, a high priority for DFC is working with Congress to pass the reauthorization bill for the agency that you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. We see this as an opportunity to reaffirm the goals of the BUILD Act and make improvements, and have been talking with members and their staff and look forward to continuing the conversation on key issues. We're eager to work with Congress to chart the best path forward for DFC. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. I know that we're having a little bit of issue with your microphone. We're hopefully going to be able to resolve that, so I apologize.
There's a little feedback.
A little bit of feedback. Apologize for that. Before I begin with questions, I want to just recognize and give a very warm welcome to Congressman Chuck Edwards. He is new. He's the newest member of this subcommittee, but I will tell you he's been aggressive. He is smart. He is going to be, I think, a superstar on this subcommittee, so it's a privilege and an honor. Thank you for serving on this subcommittee. Look forward to working with you now and in the future. Thank you, sir. I understand that earlier this year, the U.S. and Taiwan agreed to strengthen our collaboration to advance private sector development around the world through this MOU signed by the American Institute in Taiwan and the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States. Under the MOU, the DFC and the Taiwan International Cooperation and Development Fund will expand their partnership and increase collaboration in the region of shared priorities, especially obviously in the Indo-Pacific and the Western Hemisphere. All of us who are strong supporters of Taiwan and understand the importance of Taiwan welcome this increased cooperation and collaboration. And I know it's super early, but can you tell us about the likely country or thematic priorities in this new enterprise, this collaborative enterprise that you've now started?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me with the mic? Okay.
Yeah.
So you're right that the original focus of this cooperation is in the Indo-Pacific region and also in the countries that have relations with Taiwan. So in the Western Hemisphere, that would be a country like Guatemala, where we're focused on trying to find projects, and it would be great to be able to work together. Sorry about that. It'd be great to be able to work together on such projects.
Great. Particular interest in this subcommittee relates to the potential for shared projects in the Caribbean and Central America, but give us a sense of the sort of potentially commercial viable projects that you are looking at or potentially contemplating doing?
So throughout the region, the Western Hemisphere, we've been involved in projects relating to high-quality infrastructure. We funded a $150 million loan to a company called Yieldport for the development of Puerto Bolivar in Ecuador. We've been involved in hospitals, the support for small business through support for financial institutions throughout the region. Guatemala is a country where we've recently upped our game significantly with over $100 million of such funding, both for small business and for affordable housing. We're also focused on food security, a possibility of doing projects that support agribusiness and processing. But at the end of the day, the goal is to create opportunity and jobs for people at home so that they have hope and opportunity for staying in their local communities. That's really the focus.
But again, what makes us unique too is, as you mentioned in your opening statement, is the fact that you look at partnership with the private sector. These are not handouts to governments. These are partnerships with private sector, correct? Yeah, and are you optimistic about this new venture with Taiwan?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I think, as you mentioned, cooperating with partners around the world is a key to get greater leverage, more deal flow. At the end of the day, we need relationships with private sector partners, and working together with our allies, partners, friends, I think is a way for us to increase that deal flow. One challenge we have in the Western Hemisphere, and it relates to something you mentioned in your opening statement, which is country eligibility and income level.
Yep.
In the Western Hemisphere, the vast majority of countries are both either high income or upper middle income countries, and so that has been a challenge for us. It's one of the reasons why in reauthorization we would like to address the way that country eligibility is determined.
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I was going to bring that up to you. It is, we had a meeting with the ambassadors of Costa Rica and, was it Panama, right? And that issue came up. And so you're looking at, in the reauthorization, is that an issue that you're involved with trying to potentially correct?
Yes, the BUILD Act directed us to work in developing countries and really was focusing us on the poorest countries of the world. However, the standard that was used was the World Bank income classification standards. The World Bank and other DFIs don't use those standards strictly because often the calculation throws off what the underlying policy goal would be. You mentioned Costa Rica. Costa Rica is currently an upper middle income country, but we anticipate that on July 1st, when the new income categories are published by the World Bank, it's likely to graduate to a high-income country. We would no longer be able to work there.
Yeah.
Panama is a high-income country. We're not able to work there.
Yeah, and that's a problem, and that is a problem. Congressman Frankel, you're recognized.
Thank you. First, let me thank the DFC for your work on combating climate change. I'm glad that the Biden administration is awake to that crisis. We go way back. Very first, very simple question. What is the value of DFC to the United States?
DFC advances development and strategic interests of the United States. I think development is good foreign policy by having economic opportunity, economic stability in countries all over the world. That serves our foreign policy interest. Furthermore, by focusing on high-quality infrastructure, access to energy, promoting healthcare systems, we're also building the capacity in our partners and allies around the world. That's good for the U.S. taxpayer. That's good for global stability and our strategic interests. And finally,
Yeah,
I think
okay.
what we do reflects our values as a country. Doing the right thing is an important element
Thank
of
you.
that.
1 in 10 women in the world is living in extreme poverty. what kind of activities DFC's involved in to promote women's financial security for their families?
So DFC has continued an initiative started under the previous administration called 2X. 2X is a way to find businesses that are women-owned, women-led, women-managed, or serve the interests of women. Economic empowerment of women around the world is good development policy. For our lending activity, there's smart credit risk. Women pay back more frequently and at better rates than men do. The benefits from our activities, whether it's providing resilient healthcare systems, opportunities for local farmers, by focusing on getting businesses that help women, the multiplicative effect is really evident.
How much money has been invested in those programs?
Last year, of the $9.3 billion of transactions that we did, $2.5 billion qualified as 2X. So that meant they either had a certain level of employment of women, women-owned, women-led businesses, or focused on the needs of women.
There was a program, the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which I'm sure you remember was authored by Anita Lowy here.
Yeah.
I understand you partly implement that program, or
Yeah,
not?
so under the Anita Lowy Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, USAID and DFC were jointly given the responsibility for
So
administering.
let me just ask you, because we know there's turmoil in the area, obviously, since October 7th especially. Are you still able to do that work? What does it look like now? The work, just so people who are listening, this was to try to boost economic cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians.
Yeah. So it's our goal to still, and I think under the current circumstances, it's more important than ever to find ways of strengthening economic ties between Israel and Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank. We're not active in Gaza. We have no projects there, no activities there at all. But in the West Bank, we have had, over the course of the history of DFC and our predecessor agency, OPIC, through MEPA and before, we've been focused on finding ways to get financing to small business, to keep people employed, to give them hope and opportunity. We've been looking for ways to also collaborate with Israeli businesses to make investments there, and that activity continues. When I visited Israel, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel put together a roundtable of Israeli businesses that were interested, and we continue to work away at that. It is, as you mentioned, quite challenging at the moment.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is it halted, ongoing?
Yeah, some of the activity is obviously very difficult at the moment. Others, particularly given the huge decline in the economy in the West Bank, I think it was 33% in the fourth quarter. It's critical to get financing to businesses that can keep people employed so that they have...
What kind of businesses, for example?
These would be bakeries, shops, small light manufacturing, just local businesses that would be borrowers from various financial institutions.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for that warm welcome. I'm so proud to be a part of this committee and anxious to learn from each of you. Mr. Nathan, thanks for being with us this morning. During the recent debate on supplemental aid to Ukraine, members of Congress and many of my constituents have expressed concern about corruption and emphasized the need for increased oversight of taxpayer dollars. In June of last year, the Inspector General report titled Key Considerations to Inform DFC's Response to Ukraine identified areas for DFC to proactively address risks, prevent fraud, and clearly define project goals prior to funding commitments and dispersing funds in Ukraine. The report recommendations included enhanced due diligence steps to address risk, prevent fraud, and clearly define project goals prior to funding commitments. My question is twofold. What actions has DFC taken to implement the IG's recommendations on preventing waste, fraud, and abuse in Ukraine? And then secondly, can you tell us what measurable results this committee might expect to hear of during future updates?
Well, thank you very much for the question. First, I'd say we work very closely with the Office of the Inspector General, so we were glad to get their report. And in many of the principles enshrined in that report are ones that are applicable everywhere where we work, whether it's Latin America, Africa, or the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, as you point out, in Ukraine, there's heightened sensitivity because of the current situation of Russia's outrageous aggression against Ukraine, but also the operating context in Ukraine. We work very closely with our embassy colleagues who do the primary vetting of our counterparts, and we work with colleagues all across the interagency of the U.S. government to make sure that we've done know your customer, anti-money laundering, personal vetting of all of our counterparties. This is true in all contexts, but it has obviously, as you mentioned, a heightened sensitivity in Ukraine. In terms of the kind of projects that we're focused on, we are focused on the private sector, keeping businesses afloat, employing people, paying taxes, and creating economic activity so that the decline in economic activity is not as great and recovery later isn't as big a challenge. So in Ukraine, this has been support for small business through relationships that we had with existing banks and some additional banks. I think the way to measure that is the disbursement and performance of the loans, the paying back of the loans by the underlying counterparties.
And so I apologize for
yeah, sure.
interrupting you there, but I'm going to run out of time here. Have you set any measurable performance targets as a result of the Inspector General's report that you would like to share or could share with us that we can watch for?
Yeah. So the measurable targets, as I mentioned, in the loan portfolio guarantees that we give to financial institutions that then on-lend to small business is first the rate of disbursement of those loans to make sure that those loans are actually getting to the businesses that need them. And secondly, the default and recovery experience. So are we getting paid back and at what rate? That's true also in the corporate loans we made. We made a loan to a large agribusiness company. So the performance of that loan, both are they current on their interest payments, and when they have amortization or other capital paying back to us, do those flow of funds come our way? So, yep.
And so the rate of disbursement is one of the measurements. Can you tell me what this committee might expect? Like the measurement of rate of disbursement was X, and you expect it, or your goal is to bring it to Y?
We can definitely get that information to you. I don't have the exact numerical figure for that particular loan of what the.
Have those type of goals been established? Can you tell us
Yes,
that?
absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I'd be interested to see what measurable goals that we might expect out of DFC in the future. So,
No, I appreciate that.
Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. Honored to yield now to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent for my entire statement be entered into the record.
No objection.
I apologize for being late. Red eye, an hour late getting in. So thank you. Glad you're here, and have a couple of points I'd like to raise, and then a couple of questions. When I traveled to Africa and to small island states such as in the Caribbean, I meet with government officials, civil society, also the private sector. And across the board, they tell me that they want to partner with the United States. They understand the risks of agreeing to the deal terms being offered by China and Russia, and are looking for an alternative. And of course, the United States is preferable. But the United States has been slow and risk averse in helping these countries build their own economies. it's always going to take more work and attention to support the private sector in these countries. And this is, I think, what DFC was created to do. And so I was pleased to see that in FY25 budget request plan, you have more investment in deal origination, compliance monitoring, and evaluation. So I'd like to just hear a little bit more about what you face in doing deals with low-income countries and how you're addressing these challenges and how you're tracking poverty reduction impacts of these investments. Do you track them using as one measurement the Sustainable Development Goals? Even in upper middle income countries such as in the Caribbean, DFC investments are required by the BUILD Act to be geared toward reaching those most in need and fighting poverty. So could you kind of tell us how you do that and if you're using SDG goals as measurements? And then the second question I have is this. In the BUILD Act, we direct DFC to collect data on the involvement of minority and women-owned businesses in projects supported by the corporation. We also, in that report, in that legislation, we asked for you to quantify the effectiveness of the corporation's outreach activities to minority and women-owned businesses. But in the data, you don't provide Congress with any real way of quantifying effectiveness on your work with small and disadvantaged businesses, and you have not disaggregated the data by race and ethnicity. And I just have to say, I'm a former 8A contractor, 11 years before coming to Congress, and it was very difficult to partner with the federal government as it relates to being a woman-owned and African-American-owned company. But yet, when I looked at the data, it looked like goals were being reached and that the government was doing a pretty good job. Yet, when you broke it down, just as an example, African-American-owned businesses were integrated into the whole minority and socially disadvantaged business category, and you did not get a clear picture of what was taking place and what type of equity there was with regard to African-American companies, nor Hispanic companies, nor AAPI companies, or women, because it was all combined, the numbers. So we asked for you to disaggregate this, and we still don't have that.
So first thank you for the questions. On your first question about measuring development impact, and I really should have mentioned this in my answer to Mr. Edwards' question about Ukraine too. So it's not just financial performance, which I was talking about, it's development impact. We have something called our impact quotient. The BUILD Act directed us to have a framework for thinking about development impact of our projects. That's analyzed before the projects are entered into. It's part of the due diligence, part of the analysis and the decision-making around what private sector projects to support. It focuses on economic growth, on innovation, on inclusion, on other measures of development impact. And our Office of Development Policy, which in the last 2 years has grown by 50%, because given the number of deals that we're processing, we need to have a team that does both this a priori screening, but then also does monitoring and measurement of the impact of these deals and does the follow-through, and that's what that group does. The Sustainable Development Goals are part of a backdrop, but our impact quotient has a whole framework for analyzing these deals, and a report is issued before every investment committee meeting or every decision-making on every single deal. And then the key is really following that up afterward. In terms of your second question on small business and minority-owned businesses, I think we should get back to you on the specific question about disaggregating the data and see what we can do to be more transparent and clearer about that. My understanding of your question is that that's about who we contract with as opposed to the analysis of how we're affecting underserved communities, rural communities, women-owned businesses, is an enormous part of the analysis that we do for our projects and our investments. But I think you're asking
Yeah,
about
no,
the
but-
contracting
Yeah,
part.
I am.
Yeah,
But
okay.
who we impact, though,
Yeah.
we know that the face of America is diverse, and face of the world reflects many of our diverse companies in America. And so that match is very
Makes sense to
important.
me.
Thank you. Thank the ranking member, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Nathan, thank you for joining us today. Much of my work on this committee is focused on Latin America. We have seen an increase of Chinese engagement in the entire hemisphere. Trade between China and Latin America grew 26-fold between 2000 and 2020. China is now South America's top trading partner. The People's Republic of China has focused on pillaging Latin America's resources by forging deals with corrupt authoritarian governments and pressuring democracies. In Central America, they have worked to secure infrastructure with significant national security implications. In the lithium triangle of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, which contains half of the world's known lithium, the Chinese are investing heavily. How is the Development Finance Corporation effectively leveraging its resources to ensure that the U.S. can compete with China in the private sector in Latin America? And what does the Development Finance Corporation need? What additional tools or resources do you need to ensure that we have a competitive edge?
Well, thank you for the question. And I agree that it's a challenge in Latin America. We addressed earlier one of the issues, which is the income classification of many of the countries, which make us ineligible to work. Nonetheless, we're putting forth a huge effort. One element is having more on-the-ground presence. We have found that having people stationed abroad, and we only have 6 full-time employees abroad at the moment, but they disproportionately contribute in terms of deal flow, relationship building, and business development. We've announced that we would like to open an office in the Dominican Republic. We've recently opened an office in Brazil, and we'd like to look at opening potentially offices in Central America and elsewhere in the region. This will help with building deal flow, getting the kind of on-the-ground intelligence, and competing in the way you
Are
mentioned.
the embassies not sharing this information with you, or what kind of coordination
Oh, no, there's
goes
great.
into that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely didn't mean to imply
No, no,
that without on-the-ground presence, we wouldn't have that kind of resource. Between USAID missions and the economic and political sections of embassies, we have very good cooperation. There's still not, that's not to say that having a DFC employee full-time focused on building our deal flow isn't better than having relationships with our interagency partners who have many other things to focus on as well. But we have good cooperation from them.
So the law creating the DFC included my anti-corruption amendment, which requires the DFC to develop policies and procurements for or procedures for assessing whether foreign entities have in place sufficient enhancements and are doing their due diligence to ensure that they're addressing those issues of corruption. Can you give me an update on what you have, how you are dealing with this?
This is something of great importance for us. And we've devoted significant resources internally for a multi-pronged approach to making sure that our counterparties, that our investments are free of corruption. So that's know your customer rules.
Can you
That's
specifically speak to money laundering issues?
Yeah, so there's also AML, anti-money laundering. We consult our interagency colleagues, so the Treasury Department is very important for us to work with on every single project that it goes through vetting with them. We also work with the FBI's Counterterrorism Center to make sure that there's no terrorism financing or any issues related to that. We do counterparty vetting with the local embassies to make sure that we're gathering whatever information there is about our counterparties in the local markets to make sure that
Are
we're
you
free.
confident that the systems you have in place can address issues of public corruption? It takes two to tango. It's not just the governments, it's, oftentimes
Well,
the
so we have
private
the
entity.
advantage, since we're focused on the private sector, that we're vetting private parties, that we're, in most cases, not dealing with any kind of public sector situation. So we are, by definition, avoiding that kind of public sector corruption. Of course, the atmosphere, the enabling environment, the overall economic situation in a country is very important to take into account. But we're very focused on choosing the best private counterparties that we can for our transactions. It's, no guarantee that it's perfect, but I think we have a very good process in place, and we need to constantly get the resources to those teams necessary to make sure that they have the tools and the capacity to pursue the very important issue.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yield back.
We will have another round. Mr. Subcommittee, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Nathan, for coming before the committee today. In my district in southeastern Arizona, we're home to many mines, including some of which mine critical minerals. As you know, the U.S. government is finally recognizing a need to diversify our supply chain for critical minerals away from China. I personally believe we need to be making more investments here at home and couple that with securing our supply chains with like-minded nations as well. I'm interested to hear how DFC has been able to use its programs to create investments in like-minded countries for critical minerals, please. And how have these investments helped with supporting U.S. competition with China effectively?
So I completely agree with what you laid out, the necessity of competing and showing up, and we're behind and we have to start. So that's been a focus for DFC. One way that we've been able to do this is with a tool that Congress gave us in the BUILD Act, which is equity investing. We've invested in a company called TechMet, which is a U.S.-leaning critical mineral investor, both in terms of mining and processing. We've done several rounds of equity investing into this company that's promoted their development of something called Brazilian nickel, which is cobalt and nickel, and also an investment for rare earth oxides in Southern Africa. And they have a whole bunch of other projects in the works that we're highly supportive of. Last year, we also invested in Mozambique in a graphite mine to begin mining graphite. There is a processing component to that the Department of Energy is supporting here in the United States, that when that's developed, ultimately we hope that it's a Louisiana-based company, will be an off-taker from that mine in Mozambique. But this is just the beginning. As you mentioned, we're far behind, and we have to keep pressing on this
Well,
subject.
thank you for that. I do hope to stay updated on more efforts on this. Can you also discuss your current parameters, particularly regarding income requirements and how it hinders your ability to do more work regarding critical minerals?
So in terms of the income requirements, country eligibility means that we can't work in high-income countries. There's certain countries, earlier Chile came up as a potential place for lithium. We can't work in Chile.
On that, as we work towards the reauthorization of DFC, just want to make sure that we can commit to work with each other here. If you can work with me on and our mining partners in Arizona on ways to ensure positive investments are being made in our critical mineral supply chains.
Absolutely. I look forward to working together. We're always open to business contacts from wherever they come, and frequently they come from members of
Excellent.
Congress,
We'd love to
so-
take you up on that and make sure that you link up with these companies that I'm referring to in Arizona.
That's right.
One more quick question here for you. I see that investment in the Western Hemisphere currently makes up the second most active portfolio geographically. It is stated in some of your materials that investment in the Western Hemisphere can serve as a stabilizing force and help counter illicit and irregular activity related to trade and travel, including migration. I wholeheartedly agree with this. When people are able to provide for themselves in their own home countries, with stable jobs and an improvement of the quality of life, they're less likely to migrate northward. I know that living in the border region, this is clear. A lot of the people that come here and work would rather come here, work, and go back, or just stay in their countries, actually, if there's the economic development there that can sustain their families and have the middle class grow in any country that can enjoy that. You can see the benefits of that. Can you talk briefly to us on the ongoing projects that DFC has in the Northern Triangle countries?
Yeah, I mean, what you just outlined is really the reason for being for DFC, which is to promote economic opportunity, the belief that private enterprise is the sustainable way to keep people employed, give them economic hope and opportunity, and that's a reason for people to stay in their communities. So we do that particularly in the Northern Triangle through the support for financial institutions, which can get capital to small businesses, to rural communities, to operation farming, to farmers, so that they have what they need to keep people employed in their local community without having to leave. We also focus on the larger infrastructure. Access to energy is very important, so we're always on the lookout in the Northern Triangle for opportunities given the high cost of energy in those countries. That's a key to economic growth. And infrastructure to get access to markets. So we'd be very interested in roads, ports, airports in the countries of Northern Central America as well.
Great. Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Subcommittee. CEO Nathan, so my understanding is that with respect to energy and climate-linked investments, DCF's policy, and I'm quoting, seeks to unlock high-quality private investment to support climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience solutions for vulnerable communities with priority given to low and lower middle-income countries. So that's quite a mouthful, but while I know that DFC has recently increased its support for nuclear power projects, which I think a lot of us support, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your policy, what that policy means as far as financing of natural gas. And I bring that up because DFC's first Chief Development Officer, Andy Herskowitz, wrote in an article recently that if a DFC project involves natural gas, unless it's in Europe where there's special authority, DFC probably cannot support it. He wrote and went on to note, and I'll quote, this is from him, for example, even in Africa, where there are still 600 million people who have no access to electricity, there are so few exceptions for getting gas projects approved due to the U.S. administration's climate policies, and so few bankable gas projects that DFC has struggled to find Africa gas projects to finance. Now, as a reminder, the person who wrote this is not only a former DFC employee, he was the first coordinator for Power Africa. So he knows a little bit about this. So all of the examples of DFC investments in Africa for natural gas started under the previous administration. However, this administration seems to have really kind of just cut off the legs from Africa regarding their energy requirements. So in his critique, by the way, well, I already mentioned what he's taught. Is he accurate that under your watch that is going on, or are you providing meaningful new financing that includes natural gas for low-income countries such as those in Africa? Isn't there a strong development impact by working and with natural gas in Africa? Isn't that like a common sense no-brainer? But again, what we're seeing and what we're hearing from the individual I just mentioned, there seems to be an obstacle in your ability to do what is a no-brainer.
So first,
And natural gas specifically is what we're dealing with.
So you mentioned Andy Herskowitz, good friend of mine. We actually were texting this morning. And I agree with the second part of what he said, which is it is hard to find bankable projects in gas in Africa at the moment. However, we just had a project approved by our board, I think it was a month ago, for a project in Sierra Leone, which had been originated a number of years ago, but hadn't been able to close. And we continued to work at it to try to get that project into a place where it could close. It increased in capacity. It increased in size, so the total amount of financing is now $412 million. And I completely agree with what you were saying about the importance of providing access to energy to people in low-income countries. Sierra Leone is a country that has very low electricity penetration. This gas-fired turbine plant will provide over 100 megawatts of electricity to a country that currently is completely dependent on a barge that has 4 diesel gensets and creates extremely unreliable power for the country. The development impact there is off the charts, and that's why we supported the project.
So would you agree then that there is a strong impact by working, again, with the private sector to support clean energy solutions in places like Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, that involve natural gas?
Yeah, we are looking for projects in places where there's extremely high development impact, regardless of what kind of technology they employ.
Good. And you don't feel like you have impediments in order to continue to do that?
I don't.
Okay, that's good to hear. And again, that's one of the areas that I keep harping on is you got to make sure that we keep bipartisan support, and that's one of the ways to do that, to make sure that we're doing common sense things and not, virtue signaling for the sake of virtue signaling. So, to the ranking member.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just follow up on that question. Countries in Africa, they're seeking, I believe it's 150 billion annually to meet its infrastructure needs. Again, 200 billion in energy investment and more than 20 billion for healthcare needs. And so the opportunities for investment, how do you seek out these opportunities? One, also, there are regional efforts taking place, Prosper Africa and Power Africa, which have similar goals. So do you partner with them, coordinate with them? And then finally, what constraints, though, do you hear from your staff about scaling up further in Africa? Because, every time I'm there, they're talking about the importance of DFC, but yet they can't seem to get a handle on how to interact with us. And then the other part about that, do you have a list of companies that are doing business with you in Africa and in the Caribbean?
So I completely agree with what you said about the demand signal that exists in Africa. Whenever I meet with leaders of African countries, they're looking for us to show up and offer an alternative. There's a high demand for American companies. There's a high demand for what DFC provides, which is to fill the finance gap for high-quality projects that they may have in their countries. In terms of American companies active in Africa, we would love to support them. The truth is there is not as many as there are from China or from Europe. We're happy to work with companies that are, we prefer to work with U.S. companies, but many of our projects in Africa are with countries from allies and with companies from allies and partners who have great projects to provide healthcare, food security, support for small business, or infrastructure.
Well, let me just ask you, going back to my earlier question, have you made an intentional effort, and again, talking about African American companies, African American Chamber of Commerce, minority business associations, taking trade missions or making sure that they're connected with the partners in Africa through
So
DFC?
we've done a series of virtual town halls with potential partners that are focused on exactly the kind of communities that you're talking about, whether diaspora communities, U.S. companies focused on Africa or other markets where we work. We're always looking for that. We also have to leverage the resources of our interagency colleagues, given the scale of what DFC does. It's very important that we work with the Commerce Department, that we work with our colleagues at embassies who are focused on the Foreign Commercial Service.
But it doesn't sound like you've had much success.
Well, I think the reality of what I was mentioning is, for example, when we're looking at power projects, there aren't U.S. companies. If we're looking at construction projects, it's Turkish companies or Indian companies or European companies or Chinese companies. I would love it if there were more U.S. companies interested in Africa. We would be glad to look at their projects and provide financing.
There's some disconnect. The same 30-year story that I've heard over and over and over again, with a variety of initiatives that have never been that successful in Africa, business, private sector initiatives. You all don't know what the major gap is there? I mean, we have plenty of construction companies in the United States who do great work abroad in on other continents. And I know many African-American construction companies, they don't know DFC though. And they don't know how to I would say, communicate with you. And so there's some big disconnect there that's not just now, but that's a systemic and structural issue that this government has when it comes to minority-owned businesses.
Well, but I think it's important for me to go back to what DFC does, which DFC finances projects in local communities abroad that are not, I mean, we're not necessarily connected to companies of any particular type to promote trade. We're looking at projects in the local communities. So often it's companies from the country where we work that we're financing.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but
Yeah.
they have partnerships with companies from everywhere else in the world. And so how do, for instance, Chinese companies end up partnering with African projects?
Well, if you look at the way that the Belt and Road Initiative has been structured, a lot of it is at the policy direction of the government with massive subsidies. So that's kind of a policy decision as opposed to a business decision that those companies are making.
Okay. Fine, Prosper Africa. Do you work with Prosper Africa?
Sure, we coordinate with all the initiatives that are underway, whether it's Power Africa, Prosper Africa, et cetera. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to talk to you further because it doesn't seem like it ever works when it comes to Africa.
Congressman Edwards, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Nathan, for the fiscal year 2025 budget, the Biden administration is requesting nearly $1 billion for DFC's administrative and program expenses. That's about 2.6% more than the 2024 enacted amounts, primarily to support a hiring surge from more than 500 to approximately 700 staff, which includes for new overseas offices. Under fiscal year 2025's discretionary budget constraints, how does the DFC justify such a substantial expansion?
Well, thank you for the question. First, we're currently around 670 employees, 660, 670 employees at the moment. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. In order to fulfill the mandate that Congress gave us to, as we are discussing, essentially showing up in the developing world to offer an alternative, we need to increase our deal flow. Last year, we did 132 transactions. We did approximately the same amount the year before. As we build more and more deals in our portfolio, that requires more monitoring, more accounting, more deal structuring. So the capacity of our organization when DFC launched was on a much smaller footprint than the current activity level. And in order to continue this level of activity, we need to build all of our departments. So that's everything from deal origination to the HR team to support the growth of the organization. We also need to build our presence overseas. I mentioned that compared to our development finance peers, we're massively underrepresented in local markets. We have about 1% of our employee base currently overseas. Many of our development finance peers have 20 or 30% of their staff overseas. I'm not suggesting we get anywhere near that, but doubling or tripling so that we have 20 people overseas, I think will pay enormous benefits in terms of presence in countries to show up and do the kind of business development we need to keep the pace of activity that I think Congress wants to see from DFC.
And so since we're obviously dealing from two different base numbers of employees. Let's be clear. How many staff are you intending to hire? How are you going to increase staff at DFC?
So our current hiring plan has us hitting around 700, a little more than 700 at the end of this fiscal
From
year.
660.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so 40
From our
people.
current number of
40 people.
661, I think.
The BUILD Act envisioned that DFC is countering Chinese financing in overseas markets, but many estimate that the scale of China's development finance is still exceeding that of DFC and other major DFIs. How will increasing staffing and capacity for investments tangibly support U.S. competition with China?
So you're absolutely right that the scale from a value point of view of the Chinese activity is much greater than DFC. It's one of the reasons why we do try to cooperate as much as possible with our counterparts in the G7 and other allied and like-minded countries. That gives us the possibility of having a leveraged effect. You know, from our program budget point of view, I just want to point out how cost-effective DFC is. Of the $9.3 billion of deals that we did last year, that was on about $660 million of program budget. But we mentioned in reauthorization that we want to fix one of the issues related to the accounting for equity. Equity is currently very expensive in terms of how we use it. But if you took equity out of that picture from last year, it means that with $110 million of program funds, we did $8.8 billion of debt and insurance transactions. I think that's a lot of bang for the buck. It would be great with our equity tool if we had the possibility of having the budgetary accounting of that more reflect the financial reality of the use of equity. It would be great to get that same sort of leverage from our equity tool. And I think that would really serve our interests in competition with all of our strategic competitors, and especially the PRC, because we would be able to be earlier in projects, more influential on the outcomes of those projects, and frankly, take a little bit more financial risk, which I think was part of the intention of creating DFC, so that we would be able to show up in more places and make greater impact.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chair, I'll yield.
Thank you, sir. Important questions. Administrator, CEO, let's turn, and it's kind of a theme that I've been talking about a little bit today, as you'll notice. So let's turn to the administration's Partnership for Global Infrastructure, which was developed by the White House in coordination with the G7. I understand that DFC is a key partner in an interagency effort focused on stimulating economic development and offering a transparent and market-based alternative to the predatory lending of the People's Republic of China. For example, DFC is involved in providing $250 million to finance an open access rail line, which would be, my understanding, DFC's first investment in rail on the African continent. Similarly, in the Indo-Pacific, many expect that DFC will play a key role in development of the Luzon corridor in the Philippines, and that will connect Subic Bay, Clark, Manila, and the Batangas. The Luzon corridor infrastructure project just announced at the trilateral meeting between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines. I also hear may include rails, ports modernization, agribusiness, cold storage facilities, and civilian port upgrades. Now, I will tell you, those are deals which I think those are the kind of deals that have very strong bipartisan support, and I think that's great. But going back to the theme that you've heard a couple times already. On the other hand, at least with respect to projects in upper middle income countries, I understand it has been mandated that the DFC's focus include gender equity and equality, climate mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So to many of those of us in the majority, some of these priorities sound more like ESG activism run amok than a focus on your core mission, again, which is to mobilize the private capital in support of broad-based economic growth that furthers the foreign policy interests of the United States. I just want to emphasize again, it is so crucial that you maintain bipartisan support. I think what you are doing is a key component of our national security foreign policy. But if you start losing touch with what your core mission is, and you start doing, call it what you might, you're going to lose bipartisan support, and that would be a real shame. A real shame, because I think what you do, your core mission, is frankly exceedingly valuable to the national security interests of the United States, but it requires bipartisan support. And so I just hope that you are very aware of some of those landmines that I'm hoping you're not being pushed into, because that is not your core mission. And again, it would have a really, really detrimental effect. So with that, obviously any additional information or questions will be submitted to the record. CEO Nathan, thank you, first for your service, also for your time again. With that, and with the hope that we'll continue to work together on what I believe is a very important mission, we will conclude today's hearing. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.